Thank you for joining us for the final session of our four-part series the ACEC Research Institute is delivering in partnership with Accelerator for America and the New Partnership for Infrastructure. The Institute was relaunched earlier this year, and we are focused on delivering research and thought leadership for ACEC members and our industry at large. On behalf of the ACEC Research Institute Board of Directors and our many sponsors, we are very excited to support this very important initiative. We look forward to diving into today's topic on infrastructure planning and design with our esteemed panel. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for today's session, Greg Cohn. Greg consults for the ACEC Research Institute and serves as our principal coordinator with Accelerator and the New Partnership for Infrastructure. Prior to opening his consultancy firm, Greg served as the president and CEO of the American Highway Users Alliance. He was a professional staffer on the U.S. House of Representatives Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Greg is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Maryland and a former transportation engineer for the Maryland State Department of Transportation. I know he is excited about leading us through this discussion today. Greg, I'll turn it over to you.
Greg, you're on mute.
Here I am.
There you go.
Be good if the moderator can be heard. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this last in the fourth series of webinars to highlight the Accelerator for America and the New Infrastructure Partnerships work together. I'd like to really quickly thank the partners that are part of this partnership: WSP, Meridium, ACEC Research Institute, City Possible, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and HNTB. And then just discuss our process. The Accelerator for America is a terrific organization, one that they call themselves a do tank, not a think tank, and they work with leading local elected officials, primarily mayors from around the country, not just any mayors, but those that are truly the leaders, that are the innovators around our country in cities, large, medium, and small. Accelerator for America has these local elected officials basically on speed dial to identify their challenges and innovations. And then they formulated those challenges and innovations into draft federal policy that would address some key themes, primarily sustainability, empowerment, and equity. And we're now advocating for those policies at the federal level and continuing to build our coalition. So we welcome anyone on this webinar to join us in that effort, and we'll have more information about that later. Again, the mayors that are involved are local leaders, and this is really a different approach than a lot of the way federal policy is put together. So as you can see, we have a diverse group from different parts of the country and with different perspectives that help shape the recommendations for the playbook. Today, we're going to be focusing on holistic infrastructure, planning, and design. Those of you who are on the earlier webinars know that this is the fourth, but we also had webinars on funding, on streamlining and acceleration of projects, and now we're on planning and design. So our focus is that localities know best, and we just had discussion briefly with Mayor Cisneros about how when you're at the local level, you know much better than what the federal or the state government knows about how to best suit your projects for your community. And there is a need for more flexible funding at the local level, more coordination to better suit communities across the country. Growing in importance is building multimodal and complete streets to help shape the changing nature of transportation. And really nowadays, particularly in light of COVID-19, and we'll see if this continues, but tremendous growth in active modes of transportation and planning for the continuation of that growth into the future. So it gives me great pleasure to begin with our first speaker, and Mayor Holt. We've been having our active elected officials, we list them as their keynoters. So even though we don't have time for what might be a real keynote speech, we're just thrilled to have you here, and thank you for taking time out of your schedule. Mayor Holt has been the mayor of Oklahoma City since 2018. He is the youngest mayor and the first Native American mayor of Oklahoma City. And his signature achievement is the MAPS 4 project, which I'm sure he'll spend a little bit of time discussing, but it's basically a $1 billion program to address a number of critical challenges and opportunities in the city. He's a national leader. He's a trustee of the Conference of Mayors, the vice chairman of the Mayors International Committee, and a member of the National League of Cities 2020 Presidential Election Task Force. And there's more detail, of course, on this slide, but we'll let you take that home with you later, and you can read all about him. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mayor Holt.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it very much. I appreciate your palpable fear that if a mayor saw the word keynote, I was going to go on for half an hour. So I assure you, I knew my place. But thank you for the reminder. It's an honor to be with you and with everybody else on this webinar, and especially Secretary Mayor Cisneros. Thank you for blessing us with your wisdom today as well. Well, first of all, I just want to, certainly you've already done it, but I want to draw everybody's attention. I'm lucky enough to have a hard copy, but everybody can get their playbook on the website from Accelerator for America, and it really is an incredibly thoughtful document and really is informed by a lot of research. It's not just one politician's musings. I mean, it really is something you could build an infrastructure initiative on of national scale. And thank you for letting me be a part of it. And thank you for involving so many leaders around the country. I just want to say everybody who's on this webinar signed up for some very specific takeaways that are, very policy oriented, and we're going to get to those in just a minute. I'll just bring the mayoral 10,000 foot perspective real quick, and I just want to leave everybody with 3 takeaways. One is we've got to do something. Whoever is the next president in January has got to fulfill this promise that has been made for a decade now, that this country on a federal level is going to make a major effort towards infrastructure. Thus concludes Infrastructure Week is like a punchline in American politics. We have got to turn it back into something real. And so whether it's President Trump or President Biden, I hope everybody on this call will do everything they can to be a part of forcing that issue. And we send a lot of tax dollars to Washington. Obviously, we take care of a lot of things back here at home with our local tax dollars. But we need some help, and we send a lot of dollars to Washington that need to come back here and assist our infrastructure needs. So that's the first thing. I would be remiss if I didn't say it. I know we're all on that same page, but man, we got to get it done this time. The second thing that I want to say as a takeaway is, as you craft that package in the future, and certainly this is right in line with the recommendations of the playbook, remember that every city's needs are different. And I appreciate that the people on this webinar are fully aware of that. In fact, I recently got a letter from Secretary Cisneros asking me what are my needs, and he understood that they're going to be different in every city. I mean, for example, in Oklahoma City, we're 620 square miles. So, our biggest infrastructure complaint from our residents is street repairs, and we have a terrible transit system. I mean, we do the best we can with what we have, and we've got great people in charge, but we haven't made the investments in it, and we have a lot of ground to cover. So those are the kind of things that we would be, that would be top of mind for us. But that's probably a little different list than maybe a city that's more dense. They might be looking for very different things. They might be a city that's 300 years old and needs, water and sewer infrastructure. We're a city that's only 100 years old. So we all have different needs, and whatever moves forward in the future has got to appreciate that. I think also, my third takeaway, this will be short, my third takeaway is, and again, the playbook fully recognizes this, that the definition of infrastructure should be more expansive than maybe you think. I mean, if you're an engineer, obviously, or in city management, I mean, your first thoughts oftentimes are of street repairs or water pipes and, bridges and that sort of thing, drainage. That's what the layperson probably thinks of first when they think of infrastructure. But You alluded to it. We just passed here in Oklahoma City by an overwhelming majority $1 billion infrastructure package we call MAPS 4. That's following a brand that we've been using now here in Oklahoma City for 25 years. MAPS stands for Metropolitan Area Projects, and it's a 1-cent temporary sales tax that our voters have reapproved now 4 times. And it builds stuff. It is an infrastructure package. But I would point out to you that in this iteration of it, the infrastructure included things like youth centers and mental health crisis centers and a family justice center that serves victims of domestic violence, a diversion hub providing services to people in need of assistance as they work their way through the criminal justice system. We have a small business and minority-owned business support center. We have a civil rights museum and center in our historically African-American part of the city. And that's just a few of the examples. That's infrastructure, that's brick and mortar, those are all buildings, but they're serving a social need and a human need in our city. So I hope that we'll think beyond just the roads and bridges and drainage and think about the human needs that our cities have. And that's certainly something that's been front of mind for us. And I think it's a big reason why MAPS 4 passed as broadly as it did a year ago. So with that, again, you're here for much better expertise than I can provide. And I'll turn it back over to Greg and everybody else, and I'll be obviously hanging around as well. But I look forward to hearing the very important and thoughtful remarks from everybody that's a part of this panel today. And thank you again for hosting this. Thank you to Accelerator. Thank you to everybody involved. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate you very much. And our first panelist is someone who we all have known as a wonderful leader. He led the Housing and Urban Development Administration department under President Clinton. He revised public housing developments and achieved the highest rate of home ownership in U.S. history. Prior to that, he served 4 terms as the mayor of San Antonio, and then 3 terms prior to that on the city council. He remains active in housing and urban revitalization issues and is a great advocate for the Latino community in San Antonio and nationwide. And again, there's much more detail in the biography here, but I want to leave plenty of time for the Q&A. So with that, I turn it over to Secretary Cisneros.
Greg, thank you very much. And thank you to the Accelerator for America and ACEC Research Institute and the other partners who've supported this entire process, which has been very impressive and very necessary. I'm honored to join other panelists today, Rob Fuentes and Beth Osborne, and especially pleased to be sharing a podium with Mayor Holt, who I had the opportunity to visit in his office earlier this year before the pandemic, when I was in the company of a local delegation from Oklahoma City looking to do some redevelopment, and we went to consult with the mayor. On that trip, I became familiar with the MAPS 4 plan, which is a very impressive aggregation of city needs, coordinated, well presented, integrated, and the reason why Oklahoma City is doing as well as it is under Mayor Holt. Mayor, thank you for leadership. And thank you for your points today. Those are important takeaways that you have presented us. My job on this panel is to talk just a little bit about how in the world we can coordinate some of the disjointed approaches to infrastructure in the country. Even if we have a major infrastructure package, there's no guarantee that we'll be touching the right needs for the country unless we bring some principles of kind of reorganizing. Just bear with me for a second as I describe what exists. First of all, infrastructure today is planned and designed and financed at different levels. There's what we do at the local level, which is principally bond issues, and localities take responsibility for a whole host of local needs, from roads and libraries and parks and flooding and drainage and community centers and a whole lot of local matters. Counties fund some with their local authorities, so do schools, but that's one level of infrastructure planning and financing. Another is what happens at the state level, which is generally done with state funds, but it's very important because it includes things like highway systems that come into our communities, but also things like higher education. The states run the state higher education systems, the major universities, state universities, frequently involved in community colleges, and to some degree, depending on the particular state, a heavy say in public schools. And then there is what's done at the federal level, where we have a tradition of funding through grants and aid and local programs, a whole series of kinds of infrastructure. So one level of this is, one cut at this is the levels. Now, bear with me and think in terms of a matrix in which you superimpose upon those levels then a series of silos. And the silos break infrastructure down by type. So you have things like water being funded at the federal level by WIFIA, but to be coordinated with local water programs. And then you have transportation, which includes everything from Tiger grants to the Transportation Trust Fund, Highway Trust Fund, and that funds both highways in the country as well as roads that come into the cities. Then you have funding for rivers and ports important to many cities, which are run through the Corps of Engineers and their planning and financing process. And airports funded with FAA grants, some frequently matching grants. So it is a hodgepodge of who is in charge of a particular form of infrastructure, who's financing a particular form of infrastructure, and how does it all come together at the ground level? The answer is we've not done a good job of figuring this out as a country. So we have a host of disjointed efforts, underfinanced to start with, but even if fully financed, very, very disintegrated. And is it any wonder then that cities and communities and rural areas struggle in the way they do to get things funded that they really need? And nowhere is there a voice that says, how does this come together? How does this work? How do we link what we need within a city in order to envision its future? How do we focus on those things that are necessary for the new economy on top of our existing infrastructure needs? And very importantly, I think in the America of today, how does what we do in cities reach out to the rural hinterland so we can end this contentiousness, this division between what happens on the coasts in the big cities, what happens in the intermediate cities across America, and what is not happening in the rural areas, not reaching people, and they're resentful of that. I've been wrestling with this problem for a long time and decided recently to undertake a survey, which Mayor Holt referred to, with the Kinder Institute at Rice, where we're asking the mayors of the core cities in the 100 largest metros in America to tell us what their infrastructure needs are. So set up an illustrative case for Washington of what is really needed in America, not what a federal organization believes they have money to fund through a silo, but what's really needed and how these things come together at the local level. And very importantly, asking the question in such a way that it's not just what's in your traditional bag of needs for infrastructure in Oklahoma City, but what has the pandemic told you about what we need going forward that may be different than we needed in the past? We're starting to get the survey results trickle in, and we'll certainly share it with Accelerator as soon as we've got a reasonable number compiled. But what we're learning is that there's a good sense for what communities need. And they have a good sense of how that will shape their economic futures. If you believe that America is a metropolitan nation, and we've got enough proof that that's the case, if you believe that the engine of the American economy is dependent on how well our communities do, then doesn't it make sense that we would want the most integrated, the most effective infrastructure planning to create the platform in our metros and do it in such a way that it reaches out into the suburban and exurban regions of our communities? The point is two things, and I'll close with this. One, we need more effort to integrate at the federal level, and I would argue that whether it's a Biden administration or a Trump 2.0 administration, there will have to be some level of coordination supra-cabinet, higher than the cabinet, We have a number of areas where that exists in Washington today, but a infrastructure planning group at the national level to sort of think through these silos and the breaking down of the silos. But even more important than that, I think if you could only do one thing to change, if you were only given one tool to work with, I would say it would be to create a requirement for a local plan that Washington would listen to, much like we're doing with the MPOs in the transportation field, but more broadly for all forms of infrastructure, so that a city can reasonably determine how much money is going to be available to set us on the path that we need to build the future of American cities. And not just the coastal metros, the New York plan, the San Francisco plan, the Miami plan, but all across America, using the widest base of communities that we can to create a bottom-up strategy. That is, to me, the key idea here. Bottom up. Let's build America from the bottom up, with the knowledge and the experience, with the foresight of people who've been elected at the local level to chart the future of their regions. And I think that's the best way we can build the American future, the American economy going forward. Thank you. I look forward to questions.
Thank you. I have a little unfortunate icon that appeared on the top of the screen, so I'm going to fix that real quick. And I wanted to take the time also to remind our participants that this is really a unique opportunity to ask questions of Mayor Holt, Secretary Cisneros, and all of our panelists. Here we go. And use the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will be happy to forward your questions on. Our next speaker today is Rob Puentes, who I've known in Washington for quite some time. He is the president and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation, which is close to my heart. I wouldn't be in transportation in Washington if it wasn't for Eno. It's a wonderful nonprofit think tank with a mission of improving transportation policy and leadership. Prior to Eno, Rob was active for many years at the Brookings Institution as a senior fellow for the Metropolitan Policy Program, and he's still active as a fellow today. Prior to that, he was director of infrastructure at ITS America, and he worked on a variety of transportation issues over his career, including infrastructure funding and finance and city and urban planning. He's involved in a number of boards, too many actually for me to say aloud, but you can see a tremendous number of boards at the national level, also for organizations in the DC area, New York, and on the West Coast. And I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Rob, who will discuss the second of three recommendations we'll be covering today, which is this one is expanding the scope and redefining federal discretionary programs. Rob?
Thanks very much, Greg. And thank you all for joining. And it's an honor to be part of this panel with the mayors and, of course, Beth and the whole team here. So thank you for having me. I think that the general frame for the playbook is in the right place, especially referring to it as a partnership driven by local innovation. It really needs to be a partnership. I think that, as Mayor Holt mentioned at the beginning, it's great that this national conversation about infrastructure has kind of permeated the landscape. You know, we have this big overarching discussion about infrastructure as part of the federal level, but I think there's still several problems. That's why we need a playbook like this, because they're kind of at odds with one another, and why this particular recommendation about local flexibility and local innovation really matters. The first is that this national conversation is still too abstract. You know, we talk about infrastructure as if it's one thing. I think both mayors already talked about this, but it actually isn't. It isn't this one abstract concept. Actually, it's stuff on the ground. It matters. It plays out differently in different places, but it isn't an abstract concept. And so the challenge we have with this is that we fail then to link up big national priorities to our infrastructure investments. There are investments that do matter to national priorities we set out. Now, it's a challenging time in Washington. It's hard to know what our national priorities are at the current moment, but On the local level, we clearly know that. Localities routinely and very overtly and deliberately connect up infrastructure investments with the things that they are trying to accomplish around social equity, around environment, around economic growth. So all of these things play out very, very differently on the national level than the local. The second thing is that the federal programs still are so heavily siloed. It's, especially at the local level, they understand that infrastructure sectors are fundamentally related. Energy and water, or transportation, telecommunications, and housing. We know the people in the real world understand that all of these things are designed to work together and are completely interrelated. It's only really in the stovepipe world of federal Washington where these issues are kept apart and they're kept separate. Even at the United States Department of Transportation, we have the Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, Federal Railroad Administration. It's just, to coin a term, it's a crazy way to run a railroad, if you can say that. But it's a very different way to operate our infrastructure programs. The third thing is that I think we also overemphasize the federal role. Again, it's great that we've had this big national conversation, but I think the challenge is that we feel like the problem feels like it's too big, right? The Society of Civil Engineers comes out with their report semi-annually. It says I think it's a $2 trillion infrastructure deficit we have right now. Proposals on both sides of the aisle for $1.2 trillion or $2 trillion. So these giant proposals for infrastructure come out, and it just feels too big, and that only the federal government has the ability and the capacity to address those problems, because they're just framed as being gigantic things. But the reality, as the mayors have already pointed out, is that the localities are the ones who are doing the primary amount of investing. The federal role is important. It certainly matters. The states and localities certainly need it, but it fails to recognize where a lot of the investment is coming from, which is not just from the federal government, which is from the localities and increasingly from the private sector. So we need to recognize the localities provide that lion's share. So, for example, we have been tracking ballot measures that have been going in front of voters for the last few years here at ENO. There was $50 billion that was approved in 2018. There was 200 and something billion approved in 2016. It shows that when these things go before voters, they're very popular. About 3/4 of them generally seem to pass. So it's a different conversation in Washington where we can't find the money, we can't get anything done. But when you ask folks, when you come at them on the local level, when they understand what's being funded, they understand where the money is going, they're willing to pay for it. Places like Los Angeles, Denver, Seattle have done this routinely. It sounds like a lot, but the challenge we have is that the National League of Cities shows that only about 28 states allow their localities to levy additional taxes to invest in infrastructure. And there's a whole bunch of other places that simply do not have, even if they have the authority, do not have the fiscal capacity to tax their voters anymore for the infrastructure investments that they may need. So a better approach probably is to design a program that uses a sliding scale to support localities based on whatever kind of capacity they have. Los Angeles, Denver, and Seattle are very different than, I'm not going to mention other places, but places that don't have the fiscal capacity to deal with those issues right now. My friends at Brookings are working on this stuff right now. So the tailored flexibility that's part of this recommendation, I think, makes a ton of sense, especially the provision that projects specifically target racial inequity in communities of color as a key criteria for funding. It's completely been left out of a lot of these federal programs for years, and it's obviously something, given the moment that we have right now, that we need to pay attention to. So, so obviously it's a big country. We have tons of localities all across the country. Both mayors, I think, mentioned this as well. They have different needs, but infrastructure policy, I do think, needs to recognize the role of local governments in infrastructure delivery and the fact that they're not monolithic and they have their own unique needs and characteristics. Thank you very much for the time. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Rob. That's great. And our batting cleanup for us is Beth Osborne, who is Director of Transportation for America. Previously at USDOT, she served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy, as also Deputy Assistant Secretary. She managed the highly in-demand Tiger Grant program, where there's certainly never enough money for all of the wonderful applications that come in, and also headed up the Livability Initiative. She was involved in developing the surface transportation proposal for the Obama administration that ultimately led to the FAST Act, while simultaneously monitoring the implementation of MAP 21, and previously served as the Policy Director for Smart Growth America, the Legislative Director for the Southern Governors Association, and served on the personal staffs for 2 different members of Congress. So with that, Beth, I'm delighted to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm here to talk about the recommendation on National Complete Streets design principles. These recommendations are that the federal government should rely on local experience to set complete streets design principles, to adopt forward-looking roadway design standards that are used everywhere, but particularly in minority communities and low-income communities where residents will be disproportionately impacted by climate-related impacts. Their neighborhoods are usually underinvested in, and people have less access to cars, particularly to one car per person over 16. And the goal is to make streets safer, friendlier, and ultimately bolster economic revitalization and alleviate economic inequality. First off, for those that are not aware, a complete street is merely a street that is designed for all of the users who we expect to use the roadway. Now that might sound obvious, but it is the exact opposite of what we do on most of our roads across the country today. Current roadway design focuses on vehicle speed, and vehicles, drivers, as the only users of the roadway. The goal is to maintain the same high speeds we see in the middle of the night when streets are empty, even during rush hour when the roadway is full. It is a one-size-fits-all standard that applies to every roadway from highways to neighborhood roads in rural, exurban, urban communities, whether they are dense or sprawling, old or new, in the southwest, north, or east. Now, the notion that you would build for your peak time, and even if that means your roadway is empty a great portion of the day, is not very businesslike. You don't see Starbucks ensuring they employ enough people at every location so that they never have a line. You don't have restaurants ensuring that they always have enough tables so that they can take every walk-in for Saturday dinner. And airlines do not fly planes with enough space to take same-day tickets. It doesn't work either on our roadways. When you build only for cars, you just get more cars. And as we seek to make more and more room for them, you have to remove everything else. And you might start with sidewalks and bike lanes, and then you remove trees and green space and parking, and eventually you dislocate people and businesses. The result of the approach that we've used across the country is a system that is far too dangerous. We used to believe, or we used to tell ourselves, that fatalities grew because driving grew. But during the COVID pandemic, we've seen driving decrease 17%, but the fatality rate has increased 20%. And the reason for that is our roadway designs are so focused on speed that without traffic congestion to slow down driving, people are driving the speed that that design indicates for them, and they're getting in crashes that are much more deadly. This current approach leads to severe impacts on public health, both in terms of people being exposed to more PM 2.5 fine particles from those roadways and from tailpipes. PM 2.5 also making people more susceptible to underlying disorders that make COVID more likely and more deadly. There's not enough space for physical activity, though often the greatest source of public space is the roadway, which is why many communities have shut down roads or slowed down roads to make more space for restaurants, retail, and people. And they often act as a physical barrier to people trying to reach jobs, schools, or the grocery, particularly in minority communities. They can be an actual physical barrier like a highway or railway, not letting you get to things that are close as the crow flies. But they're also a financial and a general mobility barrier because they're not designed to accommodate those outside of a vehicle like a complete street is. And this impacts minorities more because they're less likely to own cars. But also, while we view this as an urban problem, 292 counties in the US are places where at least 10% of households don't have access to a car, and 56% of them are in rural areas. So this is very much a rural challenge. Now, complete streets have huge benefits. We have consistently found that they boost employment levels, property values, investment from the private sector, net new businesses, and increase active transportation and reduce crashes and fatalities. One example I know of in the city of Orlando, to take a 4-lane road to a 3-lane conversion for about 1.5 miles They also added bike lanes, a center turn lane, and wider on-street parking. They saw total collisions drop by half. They saw injuries fall by about 70%. And these safety improvements happen in the midst of more people out walking and biking. Biking counts surged, pedestrian counts rose as well by 30%, 23% each. And then they also found that they stimulated economic activity along this roadway, which by the way is called Edgewater Drive. The corridor has seen 77 net new businesses open, 560 new jobs created since the project went into effect. And the value of property has increased because there's actually huge unmet demand for this very kind of design. In fact, the demand has only been rising over the past couple of decades, but we haven't increased supply. So when you create it, the property value goes to the roof because the government has interfered with the market getting what it wants. Now, I've spent a good deal of time working with transportation engineers who want to build complete streets, but find it quite challenging. Complete streets are a best practice because in most every city and state transportation agency, they are considered an exception. And an exception requires an 18 to 24-month process to get approved for every single project. And there's never a push to streamline that inefficient and rather ridiculous process. Projects that improve safety, access to jobs, and opportunity, equity, and economic growth should not be designed as an exception. It is time to make those results easy, and they should not only not be an exception, they should be a rule.
Thank you, Beth. Sounds like there will be a streamlining, a group that's working for streamlining the development of complete streets. So terrific. Now we're going to move to our question and answer forum. And Andrew, who has really been our coordinator and leader of the partnership, is going to be taking care of questions and answers. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect, thank you. And I just want to thank you again, Mayor Holt, Secretary Cisneros, Rob and Beth, for kind of your wonderful introductions to the partnership, to the recommendations that have been made, and to your thoughts in the industry kind of, you know, as a whole. That would encourage everyone to continue to send their questions in. The first question, which I'll direct to you, Secretary Cisneros, and please, for everyone kind of add on as well, this comes from Karen and asks, part of the silo problem arises from how Congress organizes its committees of jurisdiction, especially in the Senate. And she gives the example, rail and transit funding are under two different committees, though they serve similar needs and are usually connected at city centers. How would you think about fixing that problem, or where should it really start? And again, I'll direct it towards the Secretary, but others feel free to please add on as well.
Well, it's a very good question. It's a very difficult problem, and I'll be brief in my response so that others can answer as well. The problem is really kind of at multiple levels. It is in the siloed nature of the cabinet agencies and the expertise that they have in water or in transportation or in other forms of infrastructure. But it is also in the structure of the congressional committees, the power that the appropriators have and the authorizers have, and they're spread across a whole range of congressional committees. There have been lots of conversation over the years about how to restructure those, but not, I have never seen plans that are imminent or likely. So they can do some tweaking and some improving, working with an administration that wants to do that, but I think it's a very, very hard ask. The cabinet agencies is easier, and we talked a little bit ago about a kind of a cabinet level intra-cabinet work group, like we have, for example, in the national security arena, or we have in economic policy for the country. When I was Secretary of HUD, we had a similar group for homelessness, the Interagency Council on Homelessness, and that brought in labor and education and HHS and HUD and transportation. So there is some precedent for doing it at the cabinet level. So being a practical person and one who would like to get things done, as opposed to spend the next 4 years of an administration wrestling over restructuring congressional committees. That's why I argue for some mandates and requirements that require coordination at the local level, where federal agencies have to fit into some kind of a local template within a larger infrastructure plan. That has a couple of elements. One is it assumes that a local city or metro knows what it needs. I think that's a safe assumption. That it's thought about not just the present, but also how does it build for the future and knows what it needs in that respect. I think that's a safe bet. And then it would require some kind of respect from the federal agencies for that local effort. We've done this before in other areas using the councils of government, using the MPOs, as I said earlier. But I think it's time, if we really want to have infrastructure impact in the country that matters, that shapes the future, to be thinking in these terms. I know I haven't answered the question about the congressional committees, but I've never seen a reasonable solution that can be done in less than a few decades.
Andrew, I'd love to jump in there.
Go for it.
I worked for Senator Carper at a time where he was on all three of the Senate transportation policy committees. I say policy committees because there's a fourth one in charge of funding it. And we were the only office on all three. It does make it nearly impossible to have a truly thoughtful and customer-based transportation system because you're so modally siloed. And of course, Secretary Cisneros is right. Any sort of restructuring in either of the houses on Capitol Hill is an enormous undertaking, and we can't wait for it. We've got to find ways around it. However, I will say that it causes massive problems. When I was in the Obama administration, we created a White House directed program called Strong Cities, Strong Communities in order to help cities weave through all the varying rules on different agencies, many put on by different committees, trying to do the same thing, but doing it in different ways that made it impossible to do the thing both of them wanted done. They also put requirements on their different grants that made it impossible to combine money between agencies to give to those locals. So there are probably things we can do short of a complete restructure of Congress, but we need to point out to them where they're making it impossible to do what they ask to be done. And I'd also argue that particularly in the Senate, I think some of the jurisdiction could be transferred. I think a strong leader of one committee could take some jurisdiction. I grew up in the House under John Dingell, who always said that all of the jurisdiction of the Commerce Committee were the bills that started with HR. So I'm pretty ambitious on that front.
And also, I think this is part of the reason why people every once in a while will call for a capital budget on the federal level. I'm not advocating for that one way or another, but as the mayors know, and on the local level, this is how we do this long-range planning. We don't really have that ability on the federal level. And then I think it's why these ideas for National Infrastructure Bank pop up from time to time. Again, not advocating for that one way or another, but to find that ability to make those investments for projects that actually meet some kind of measure of national priority. And I don't mean just projects of national significance or earmarks or things like that, but if we have national strategies around something, the last administration wanted to double exports in 5 years as a national economic strategy. That makes sense. Then you can organize then infrastructure investments to get you to that larger economic strategy. An infrastructure bank might be able to do that. If you structured it the right way, that might be one way to get around some of those silos.
One other thing that could be helpful, and it doesn't speak to the congressional problem, but it puts it at least in a situation where you can work with it, would be for a White House that declared that infrastructure was a priority and was able to get $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion or something funded for infrastructure, to assign a responsibility. We have a National Security Council, we have a Domestic Policy Council, and we have a National Economic Council. My guess would be it would fit best in the context of the National Economic Council, and create a office in the White House that was effectively a war room that could work with the metros across the country and begin we can do this now with the compute. We have the computing power to do it, to put together a list of what the communities need, and then begin to advocate for them, to be an ombudsman for them with the agencies and with the Congress to create some place that's thinking holistically about funds that go into communities. That would be, it's not the answer to the congressional problem, but it would help sort of mitigate the dimensions of the problem, because somebody in Washington is thinking locally.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'm going to direct this next question at Mayor Holt. And something, Rob, you brought up in your remarks about the success of local ballot measures, and contrasted strongly to the inaction you're seeing in Washington, and just alluded to a kind of capital budget as another kind of potential piece of that. Mayor, do you mind speaking a little bit to why you think MAPS 4 and other ballot measures have been so successful recently? I think that it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, like a lot of cities, we have to take it to a vote. And we know that, I'm in politics. We have lots of people involved who have a sense of politics. And so we find a happy medium between the needs of the city as they actually are and as they are perceived by the residents. And sometimes that's not always the same, because, those of us who are closer to it may see deficiencies that need to be addressed. But that whole process allows us to communicate that back to the residents, and it also allows the residents to communicate to us what it is that maybe we're missing that's important to them. And so, MAPS 4 was the culmination of a year-long process in our community, and you might argue a multi-year process, really, as you move towards that initiative. And I think every community that's successful in passing these probably goes through something similar. I mean, we had a website, we took in ideas, what should be in MAPS 4. We had 26 hours of council meetings where everybody who wanted to came in and spoke and talked about their vision and dream for the future of our city. And then we cobbled all that together into $1 billion package with 16 projects. And then we spent another 3 months selling that to the voters. I mean, that's a hell of a process. It's a hell of an engagement process. And probably every city goes through some version of that when they pass these things. And it brings a great outcome. I mean, I'm sure if I had just sat in a room and created MAPS 4, it might have looked different, and I might have really probably been missing the mark in some respects, because I wouldn't have had that give and take with the people of Oklahoma City that was involved in that creation process. So, that can't be replicated by a congressional debate, I mean, no offense to my member of Congress or anybody else's member of Congress, but one person can't capture, that conversation that occurred involving tens of thousands of people here in Oklahoma City. So that's why, give us some kind of flexibility, give us some kind of block grant, put some parameters around it, and we'll go through processes like that to find its best use. And actually, I would not to deviate too far from here, but as a good analogy, the CARES Act dollars that cities over 500,000 received it's kind of a block grant, has provided a lot of room for innovation. And here in Oklahoma City, we created from scratch a small business continuity program that we think is doing a hell of a job and has put over $20 million out into the community. And it was completely created, here in Oklahoma City and with federal dollars. So you give us that ability to be a laboratory, and we will maximize it. And I think many cities will succeed more if they can have that kind of opportunity.
Great point. Can I add a point to what the mayor has just said, but also what he said earlier, the takeaway on redefinition of infrastructure to be more expansive, because I think it fits in here. My sense is that if you asked cities today what they needed in infrastructure, it would be slightly different than it was a year ago today because of the pandemic and the economic turndown. So what you would hear, and we're seeing this in these surveys that I described to earlier, the early returns, a lot of emphasis on broadband. I'm surprised at how many of the surveys speak to broadband, because cities found they could not do online education if families didn't have access to broadband. They couldn't do remote medical attention if there wasn't some sort of telemedicine arrangements. So broadband is one of those. Another is clinics that are an expansion off of the public hospital system. I've had any number of administrators of public hospitals, county hospitals, city hospitals say, we were filled with COVID people, some who were over the worst and didn't need to be there, but we didn't have any other place to put them. Therefore, people who needed other treatments couldn't come in, and it was a crisis in security after community. So my point is, when you listen to the real needs at the local level, you're going to pick up different themes than the country understands as a whole. And these related to the pandemic are very real, and speak to the mayor's point about redefining infrastructure in a way that is appropriate to the times. Schools that provide for more social distancing in their physical plants going forward, clinics, broadband, these are areas that you wouldn't have probably called infrastructure in a previous iteration.
Great, thank you. I didn't know if Beth, if you maybe wrote to add to what the mayor was saying, or?
I mean, I'll just add one thing, because I completely agree about the notion that cities are in closer touch with their taxpayers. And so, of course, their taxpayers are more willing to give money to their cities for things that they understand, for a set of projects that they clearly understand, or some goals they understand will be undertaken. At the federal side, our program is based on a perplexing but politically comfortable distribution of dollars to locals for projects that we will not commit to or explain about, or not to locals, to states, really. And then we say it wasn't enough and we need more to distribute for projects that we won't talk about or dictate or explain or commit about any results for. And it's just not a very convincing pitch. You know, please give me your money because I will spend your money really well is about as clarifying as the federal pitch has been. And I think it's time that the program be about something a little more clear. I'd also love to see the federal program more directly fund locals. Right now, the transportation program in particular is nearly entirely state run. While the feds get the blame, really the feds are a pass through, and most complaints with the way the program runs falls on the state's heads.
And I'll say they're a pass through for highway projects, right? I mean, it's as close to a blank check as the federal government comes to writing. For other projects, for transit, for example, it's a completely different process where the federal government has a profound role to play, and you have to go through a tremendous number of hoops. And so it really is just an unlevel playing field. So even though we talk about these things as siloed and that they're supposed to work together, not only do we keep them compartmentalized and separate, but we actually treat them very, very differently in terms of how they're approved, how they're funded, how they're processed, and then what the federal role is overall. That does have to change.
Well, I hate to cut this off because this is a wonderful discussion, but I know that we've only promised 1 hour of our folks' time here. And I wanted to really take the time to thank everyone for their participation into this fascinating discussion. Let me just, for our audience, encourage them to read the full playbook. You know, we only had an hour here to discuss 3 plays in the playbook, but there are 26 of them. There's actually even more detail on the 3 that we've already discussed in terms of how we're approaching it for advocacy purposes. And just encourage everyone to weigh in on COVID-19 relief and reauthorization. And beyond that, of course, we potentially have another shot at infrastructure bill, which may be something that crosses the traditional jurisdictions without running us into too much trouble, given that it's a leadership-driven effort. There's good and bad to that. We want to encourage everyone to join with us. We're working with federal legislators and policymakers. If you liked what you heard today, visit acceleratorforamerica.org and learn more about how you can get involved. And our last event, really the wrap-up event, is at the ACEC fall meeting, which is October 28th. That will be an opportunity to learn broadly about all of the work of the new Partnership for Infrastructure. All of the plays broadly will be discussed, and we're going to have a wonderful panel starring Mayor Eric Garcetti from Los Angeles, and a number of other elected officials and really high-level participants. So to visit, to sign up, visit acecresearchinstitute.org for that. And again, this entire event will be available to the participants in a recorded form. So you're welcome to share it with others. Thanks again to all of our participants today. We really appreciate your time. I think it's been an excellent webinar, and we look forward to working with all of you in the future.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks all.